So why is it psychiatry is so unpopular? Well, let's go back to the last time psychiatry was really very popular, and that goes back to the 1960s. And it's very interesting. There's a famous film by Alfred Hitchcock called Psycho, which I think was made in '63. And in Psycho, I don't want to spoil the ending for people, but in Psycho, at the end of the film, when the murderer the guy who's been performing a series of very bizarre serial killings, and by the way, the film is based on a true story, and the real person who did the real murders, the story is much more bizarre and frightening than what ended up in Psycho. And the guy actually, Ed Gein, who was the person who committed the real murders on which Psycho is based, and he died as recently as the 1980s. He was incarcerated. The true story of Psycho is very interesting. But in the final scene, a psychiatrist the police turn to the psychiatrist to explain this bizarre series of murders. And the psychiatrist leans nonchalantly against the mantelpiece in the police station, lights up a cigarette. Oh, for the days when we could light up a cigarette and nonchalantly explain everything, and explains the series of bizarre murders. And he uses basically a psychoanalytic explanation. And he talks about how the person who committed the murder basically internalized the mother. He developed a strange hatred of the mother, but then internalized the mother. This explains why he dug up his mother after the mother had died and then kind of walked around wearing the mother's skin, etc., etc., etc. Now, what's really interesting is the lay public, if I can use this patronizing term, who watch this final scene are kind of enraptured and think the guy is a genius with this explanation. Every psychiatrist I've ever met who's seen this scene can't make head or tail of it. It makes absolutely no sense to any psychiatrist watching it. But here's the key bit that Hitchcock, that master director, understood. It was a bloody good story. The guy at the end tells a cracking story. And the psychoanalytic idiom is about telling a cracking story. The problem is the story probably wasn't true. So what happened in the old days with psychoanalysis is the patient came along, told a story, the story of their lives, and the psychoanalyst listened carefully to the story, pondered it, and then told you back a story. And the story they told you back was even more riveting than your story. And hence, that was kind of exciting. And it was exciting to be a psychoanalyst. It was exciting to be a patient. So you went to the psychoanalyst and said, I have homicidal feelings towards my boss. I hate my boss. I hate my job, but I hate my boss. I'm really worried that one day I'm going to stab him in the eye with a pencil. And the psychoanalyst pondered and said, well, you know what's really going on here is that you fancy your boss. This is repressed sexual erotic feelings for your boss. And you thought, what? But it was kind of exciting that this other story that was being told. So psychoanalysis was basically about storytelling. And there was something creative about the way they came up with their stories. Now, they'll hate me for saying that because they'll say it wasn't an act of creation, it was an act of analysis, it was detective work, and it's a true story. I don't think it is a true story. I told you another story, a neuroscience story about love just now, and because I mentioned the word brain scanning, etc., because the current idiom of the day is science and neuroscience, there's a sense in which I'm telling you another story. It's just another story. It's a neuroscience story. You kind of take your story and you decide which stories you're attracted to. However, what I'm trying to argue is psychiatry has lost something fundamental if we just stick with a neuroscience story, because I think that there's a sense in which we lead our lives in a relationship to stories. Hollywood is a big consumer of stories and spits them out. And we consume a huge number of stories on a daily basis. We read books, we read novels, we watch movies, we read the newspapers. The recent terrible tragic events in Paris. We saw film events on our screen, then people started telling us a story about what was going on. And we bought that story. The reality is, if you went into great detail about what actually happened in Paris, I don't know what actually happened, but it's likely the nitty-gritty details possibly don't fit into a simple story pattern. But people want a simple story. They find it reassuring. They want a story with a hero and a villain, and they want a conclusion, which is a happy ending. And our leaders are telling us another story about why military action in Syria or bombing Syria or whatever is the right thing to do. But to my mind, it's a story. And what our leaders are often very good at is telling stories that people buy. Now, The key point about all of this that I'm driving at is at the heart of our lives are stories, stories we tell ourselves about our lives. Patients go to psychiatrists and tell a story about their lives. If psychiatry abandons the whole story thing, and one of the reasons I wrote this as a story was about the idea that psychiatrists don't seem to write stories or embrace the notion of stories, stories fundamentally galvanize people. That's why leaders tell you a story about we're under imminent threat, therefore we must do airstrikes in Syria. They tell a story and it galvanizes people. It's one of the fundamental motivating things is you hear a story, it moves you emotionally, and then it makes you go and perform an action. And that's the key thing that's at the heart of what psychiatry is meant to be about. It's about helping people do difficult things.